Hey and welcome to the Leftover Culture Review. Today we're covering a game that I am super stoked about. I've always really enjoyed the Double Dragon series, even when it was totally butchered to work on the Atari 2600. I could still really appreciate the genre. The graphics weren't great, but it was still a 2D beat 'em up, and it was so exciting for me growing up, having the privilege of seeing where it started, to see where it was going, especially when we got the Sega Mega Drive. So if you thought the lack of globe-trotting adventure, black magic and racial stereotypes was really holding this series back in games 1 and 2, then dudes, strap yourself in because this is going to be the raddest, most awesome Double Dragon game you'll ever experience, coming up after the intro. When Double Dragon 3 Rosetta Stone hit the arcades, it had competition. It was time to step up the game. No survivors this time. Double Dragon came out, arms flailing all over the place, hoping to land a punch, probably a little bit off balance before stumbling onto the only home system that can handle this much action in one cartridge, the Sega Mega Drive. So coming from the Double Dragon that I first experienced out there on the Atari 2600, Double Dragon 3 looks freaking amazing. Comparing it to something like Streets of Rage though, yeah, there's literally no comparison. Double Dragon 3 is a really strange beast of an arcade port, and Technos, the Double Dragon developer for the first two games, it really felt like they were starting to run out of ideas, and by this third game they were actually outsourcing the Double Dragon development to another party. So yeah, things look and feel different, especially when you're comparing this game with the Super Double Dragon on the SNES. They're two very different looking games. I often feel like the Mega Drive kept things leaner, less vibrant, more gritty, and kinda worse. But the Sega version was the only one that could promise real martial arts action right there on the box. Like my favourite ever karate move, the flying headbutt. I'm not sure if that is in the Super Nintendo version. If I'm wrong, be sure to let me know in the comments. Like I said, this was a kind of a strange port from an arcade game. For the first time ever in Double Dragon, you actually got like a coin count at the start of every game. You could set how many coins you had in the options, but during the game you could actually visit the shops and purchase things like extra moves, extra weapons, extra characters, or even refilling one of your health bars. I don't know if it would be worth using up a whole credit to refill a health bar, but it was totally an option. When this game was actually first released in the arcades, they had the option for players to purchase these things during the game using real money, so real credits going into the machine, giving them things that they already had access to in the previous Double Dragon games, things like the weapons and the power-ups. And also, looking at this arcade footage, right, I assumed the Sega version was going to be a slightly lackluster port. We're talking about the Mega Drive. It's not the graphic powerhouse that the Super Nintendo was, I'm a little bit ashamed to admit. I assume the frame rates were capped, I assume the game just wasn't that well ported, and the arcade version would have a lot more going for it. I was really excited to check out the arcade version, but looking at them side by side, the Sega version still wins for me. It was just so much more fun to play. The frame rates felt more consistent, the fighting itself was a lot more fun, and it felt better balanced. Also worth mentioning that the arcade version originally came out in 1990. With the Sega version, Double Dragon 3, the arcade game, coming out 2 years later. Super Double Dragon for the Super Nintendo was released in the same year, 1992, and then I guess we also had games like Battletoads and Double Dragon, which were released in 1993. Great games, but I don't really think they should count. They were developed by Rare, they are Battletoad games with Double Dragon characters in them. So look, I might have oversold the real martial arts action. I might have actually oversold the idea that this game was good at all in the intro, but it's still a blast to play, especially with a friend that you can laugh with. It's such a short game, I don't think you can hate it. It's all pretty harmless, unless of course you were one of those kids who were unfortunate enough to drop a bad amount of pocket money on it. I think for a lot of people, Double Dragon 1 and 2 were really solid. Those mechanics were really tight, and the ports themselves actually held up pretty decently So for a lot of 8-bit gamers, Double Dragon was probably like their first experience with a scrolling 2D beat-em-up game, so the expectations were really high. And then we got this. It's a globe-trotting beat-em-up adventure across the whole world where you can take on fights in like ancient Italy, China, and then straight over to Egypt to fight trees and mummies. It's incredibly different from anything before it, but looking at where the series went, I like to think that this was the turning point. So we got this silly Mega Drive game, and then only 2 years later we got the live action movie Double Dragon, which was just as sure to delight fans. After that we got the animated cartoon series, and then the 5th game in the line, Double Dragon 5 Shadows Fall. So there were a lot of achievements for a video game franchise over those few years. Double Dragon was putting out everything it had. It's just a shame those were really the worst years to be a fan. The charm from those original Double Dragon games just didn't carry through once they started to try and make it go big. This game feels to me like that was the turning point. This is when things got silly. And hey, for any Super Nintendo sympathizers out there, there was this. Super Double Dragon, basically like Double Dragon 4. No globetrotting adventure, no racial stereotypes, and as far as I can tell, there was no black magic either. This was pretty much like a return to roots, custom made for the Super Nintendo. Interestingly enough, this was one of the only Double Dragon games that was developed for a console. It wasn't ported from an arcade release. So yeah, as a Super Nintendo fan, you gotta ask yourself, do you really want another traditional side-scrolling beat-em-up when you got something so much cooler over on the Sega? Yeah, actually, to be honest, this game sounds a whole lot better on paper, but you know, let me know in the comments if I'm really missing anything here and if it's worth doing a review on Super Double Dragon. And for all you NES fans holding their copies of Sacred Stones limply in their hands, thinking if I'm going to get around to review that, I actually had Sacred Stones and I sold it when I sold my NES. I like games that I can win. I don't like getting my butt handed to me again and again. But in the Sega game, I had a fighting chance. And if all you take away from this review is an amazing flying headbutt move that you can use at home, so be it. I like to think that this pretty much marks the end of the run of the original Double Dragon games. You know, Super Double Dragon as well as Double Dragon 3 on the Sega Mega Drive. After this, we got Double Dragon 5 Shadows Fall on pretty much every system ever, including the Atari Jaguar. It's a massive departure from the side-scrolling beat-em-up. It's a 2-player fighting game, and it's based off the animated cartoon, so there's a lot of differences between that and this game. There was also another Double Dragon fighting game on the Neo Geo. That's, again, it's not as close to the cartoon, but it's not as close to the 2-player beat-em-up. It's basically just a fighting game that was branded Double Dragon, to the best of my knowledge. There's a few characters that line up, but not all that many. So yeah, this is it for the 2-player side-scrolling beat-em-up. I really appreciate you guys checking out the video. Please leave a comment and subscribe if you want to see more. I'm not going to leave you guys hanging though. I've done so many beat-em-up game reviews, side-scrolling beat-em-up, particularly 3D beat-em-ups as well. So I'm going to link a couple of them for you now, including some of my favorites like Zombie Revenge on the Sega Dreamcast. That was a hell of a fun episode to put together, and I was really proud of how all the effects came out. So I'm going to link that through to you. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and until next time, cheers.